The day they came to throw her out, even the sky seemed to ache. Clouds hung low, gray and heavy, pressing against the rooftops of Maple Street as though the heavens themselves were ashamed to watch. Alyssa Grant stood at the edge of her porch, the eviction notice trembling between her fingers. The bold black letters screamed louder than the wind. "Vacate premises immediately." Behind her, two small faces peeked from the doorway. Naomi, 8 years old, her hair in tiny braids, hugged a teddy bear so tightly its fur looked thin. Caleb, just 5, clutched his backpack, eyes wide, silent. He didn't understand the words on the paper, but he understood the fear in his mother's voice when she whispered prayers she didn't finish. Alyssa didn't cry. Not yet. There was no time for tears when the world demanded strength. She folded the notice, slid it into her coat pocket, and took one long breath that stung like cold water. In that breath lived memories, of long nights at the diner, of cleaning offices under fluorescent lights, of promising her kids that all this hard work meant something. But today, all it meant was defeat. The landlord's car rolled into the narrow driveway. It was spotless, silver, and humming like arrogance itself. Richard Dalton stepped out, white, middle-aged, his tie perfect, his posture colder than winter. He didn't greet her. He didn't even look at the children. He looked at his clipboard, flipping through papers like she was a line item on an invoice. "Ms. Grant," he said flatly, "we've gone over this. Rent's been late 3 months. The court order's final." Alyssa's voice was calm, but her hands shook. "I told you my hours were cut. I'm catching up. I can." He raised a hand, cutting her off. "I run a business, not a shelter. You've had extensions. I've got new tenants waiting." The words sliced clean. Naomi flinched as 2 movers appeared behind him, stepping past her mother, entering their home like it already wasn't hers. Alyssa watched, powerless, as they carried out her life one box at a time. Books she'd collected from thrift stores, her children's drawings, the chipped mug she drank from during endless night shifts, each item a piece of a story being erased in real time. Neighbors pretended not to see. Curtains fluttered shut. The city had a way of looking away from pain it didn't want to claim. When it was done, when the movers drove off and Richard folded his papers back into his briefcase, Alyssa spoke, her voice steady, even gentle. "You'll see me again." He gave a short laugh. "Not likely." But she didn't say another word. She simply took her children's hands and walked away. The rain began then, slow, cold, relentless. And with each step she took down that cracked sidewalk, her tears blended with the skies. That night, they slept in her car. It was cramped, the seats sticky from years of wear, and the smell of old fries lingered from her last shift at the diner. But her children were safe, bundled under a blanket, their small breaths steady. Alyssa sat awake, staring through the windshield at the city lights in the distance. She had no money left. No home. No plan. But she had something Richard Dalton would never understand, the kind of strength that only comes when you've lost everything. Days turned into weeks. She found temporary refuge in the basement of a friend's apartment. The kids slept on a fold-out couch. She took the floor. The sound of trains outside kept them awake, but Alyssa told stories to distract them. Stories about dreams, about courage, about women who built empires out of nothing but pain and perseverance. She didn't know it then, but those stories would become blueprints. Her mornings began at 4 a.m. She'd pack lunches for Naomi and Caleb, then walk to the bus stop for her first job at the diner. The same customers, the same tired smiles, the same tips that barely paid for bus fare. After her shift, she'd rush to the office complex across town to clean floors and empty trash cans. By midnight she was home, or what passed for home. Every muscle in her body ached, but each night she whispered the same words before closing her eyes. "This is not how it ends." One afternoon, weeks after the eviction, she passed by her old apartment building. She hadn't meant to, but the bus took a detour through Maple Street. The building looked the same, maybe cleaner, newer paint on the doors. But to her, it felt like a ghost. Through the window, she saw Richard Dalton giving a tour to a young couple. He smiled the way only men who never knew struggle smiled. Wide, confident, hollow. Alyssa's heart burned, not with hate, but with a deep, quiet resolve. If life was going to teach her lessons, she would learn them all, and one day she would teach her own. That night, she sat on her borrowed mattress scrolling through her phone, looking for extra jobs. Instead, she found something else, an online ad for a free community course in real estate fundamentals. She almost scrolled past it. It sounded ridiculous. What did she know about property ownership? She could barely afford rent. But then she remembered Richard Dalton's words, "I run a business, not a shelter." And something inside her whispered, then maybe it's time you learn to run one too. She clicked register. The next few months became a blur of exhaustion and discovery. Between jobs, she studied, taking notes on her phone while wiping tables, reading about mortgages during bus rides, whispering definitions of equity and investment under her breath as she mopped floors. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the Wi-Fi in the basement failed, when Naomi had nightmares and Alyssa had to choose between sleep and study. But slowly she began to understand. For every landlord like Richard Dalton, there were systems, loopholes, programs, opportunities that could change who held the keys. She started saving every spare dollar. She stopped buying coffee, skipped lunches, sold old clothes. Her friends called her crazy, said she was chasing an impossible dream. But Alyssa had already seen impossible up close, and survived it. She wasn't just studying to pass a class. She was studying to rewrite her story. The course ended with a simple line from her instructor that would stick with her forever. Real estate isn't about buildings. It's about power, who has it, and who's told they never will. That night, Alyssa cried for the first time since the eviction. Not from sadness, but from awakening. Because for the first time in years, she didn't feel powerless. She felt ready. Winter arrived early that year. The wind cut through Alyssa's thrift store coat as if determined to remind her how far she still had to go. The basement that served as her temporary home smelled of damp carpet and old paint, but she made it feel warm. On the wall, she taped a piece of notebook paper with 3 words written in thick marker. "Own something someday." Every morning she read them before leaving for work. Every night she whispered them before sleep. The course she'd taken opened a door, but stepping through it required courage she wasn't sure she still possessed. She learned about credit scores, loans, liens, terms that had once sounded like another language. And yet, the more she studied, the clearer her purpose became. To turn the thing that broke her into the thing that built her. At the diner, Alyssa began watching people differently. The suits who lingered over black coffee at noon weren't just customers. They were investors. She noticed how they spoke, what papers they carried, how casually they tossed around numbers that could feed her children for a month. She listened more than she talked. Observation became her education. One afternoon, while refilling coffee, she overheard 2 men discussing a rundown duplex on the east side. "Too much work," one said. "Not worth the headache," said the other. Alyssa wiped the table beside them, pretending not to hear, but inside her chest something sparked. That night she searched property listings until she found it, the same duplex. The price was low, frighteningly low, because the place was nearly condemned. To everyone else it looked worthless. To Alyssa, it looked like a beginning. She didn't have money for a down payment, not even close. But she had persistence. She visited a local credit union that specialized in community loans. The banker, a middle-aged woman named Maria, listened quietly as Alyssa told her story, how she'd been evicted, how she was rebuilding. Maria leaned forward, her expression softening. "Most people come in here asking what they can get. You came in asking what you can build. That matters." The loan she received was small, but it was enough to buy the duplex and start repairs. Alyssa signed the papers with trembling hands, tears blurring her vision. For the first time since Maple Street, she had an address that belonged to her. The building was worse than she expected. Mold crawled up the walls, the roof leaked, the plumbing wheezed like an old man. She spent every spare hour there, scraping, painting, learning to fix what she couldn't afford to hire out. Neighbors watched in disbelief as a single mother with 2 kids transformed a ruin into a home. Her children learned alongside her. Naomi mixed paint. Caleb handed her nails. It became their weekend ritual, music from a small radio, laughter echoing through bare rooms. Every repaired wall was a lesson in resilience. Still, the money ran thin. She skipped meals to stretch groceries, sold her wedding ring for supplies, took night shifts until her body ached. There were moments she wanted to quit, but every time she closed her eyes she saw the day of the eviction, the smug face of Richard Dalton, the rain, the humiliation, and it fueled her. After 6 months of sweat and borrowed time, the duplex stood ready. Fresh paint gleamed under the sun, flowers bloomed by the steps. When she rented the other half to a young couple who'd been struggling to find affordable housing, she realized something profound. She made only a small profit, but that profit changed everything. It proved her dream wasn't fantasy, it was strategy. Alyssa reinvested every dollar, learned about grants for minority women in real estate, attended free seminars, listened to podcasts during bus rides. Her world expanded with every fact she absorbed. Then came the first setback. A plumbing burst during winter, flooding the lower unit. The tenants demanded repairs she couldn't afford. The bank threatened penalties. For 2 sleepless nights she thought she might lose it all again. But instead of surrendering, she reached out to community programs, to the same Tenants for Patients, to a local church group that offered volunteer help. Together they fixed what broke. And with that crisis came credibility. People noticed the woman who refused to quit. One investor she'd met at a seminar offered to mentor her. He didn't treat her like charity, he treated her like potential. Through him, she learned about small multifamily properties, 3 for units, where the returns were steady and the impact greater. Within 2 years, Alyssa owned not just the duplex, but 2 more buildings in nearby neighborhoods. Her name, once synonymous with late payments, now appeared on county property records beside words like owner and investor. At night, when her kids were asleep, she'd sit on her balcony and look at the city lights. She still lived simply, still wore thrift store clothes, still cooked budget meals, but inside she felt a quiet power. She no longer feared the word eviction. She understood ownership, not just of property, but of destiny. She also kept a folder, tattered, overfilled, with every eviction notice, every bill she'd struggled to pay, every letter that once made her doubt herself. She called it the archive of never again. Sometimes she'd show it to Naomi and Caleb. This, she'd tell them, is what strength looks like on paper. The children grew confident, reflective mirrors of their mother's resilience. Naomi excelled in school, inspired by stories of architecture and business. Caleb, curious and kind, often said he wanted to build homes for people who don't have any. Their dreams became extensions of hers. And while Alyssa's new life blossomed, Richard Dalton's empire began to crumble. Economic shifts hit his portfolio hard. His arrogance kept him from adapting. Vacant units piled up, maintenance costs soared, and lawsuits from neglected tenants drained his accounts. The man who once bragged about never giving second chances now needed one himself. He listed several properties for sale, including the old Maple Street complex, the same one where he'd evicted Alyssa. The irony escaped him at first. Desperation blinds pride. When Alyssa's mentor forwarded her the listing, she stared at the screen in disbelief. Maple Street. The address burned into her memory like a scar. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, "We're going home." The email sat open on Alyssa's cracked phone screen, the address glowing in tiny blue letters. 245 Maple Street. For a long moment she just stared at it. The place where everything had fallen apart. Where her son's toys had rolled across rain-soaked pavement as strangers carried their furniture away. The place that had once represented defeat. Now, that same address was listed under, "For sale." Her heart pounded, not from fear this time, but from something sharper, hungrier. This wasn't just property. This was closure. Alyssa called her mentor, Mr. Thompson, immediately. "You're not thinking emotionally, are you?" he asked, voice calm, cautious. "I'm thinking strategically," she said. "And maybe, poetically." There was a pause. Then a chuckle. "All right then. Let's make the numbers make sense." The day Alyssa drove back to Maple Street, the city looked both familiar and foreign. New coffee shops stood where old storefronts had once been. Kids rode bikes past cracked sidewalks she remembered tripping on while carrying groceries years ago. When she pulled up to the old apartment building, her breath caught. It was smaller than she remembered, but somehow heavier with memory. The paint had peeled, the stairs sagged, and a for sale sign leaned crooked in the yard. Alyssa walked up the steps slowly, her hand grazing the railing she once held as she carried a sleeping Naomi. Inside, the air smelled of dust and disrepair. Her footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, bouncing off faded wallpaper and hollow rooms. She stopped at Unit 3B, their old apartment. The door still bore a faint outline where her nameplate had once been. For a moment, she pressed her hand against it and whispered, "We made it back." Mr. Thompson joined her moments later, briefcase in hand. "We'll have to go through the bank directly," he said. "Dalton's finances are in trouble. He's liquidating to stay afloat." Dalton? The name hit her like a gust of cold air. "Yes," Thompson confirmed. "He still owns this property. For now." Alyssa swallowed hard. The man who had once thrown her and her children into the rain now had to sell to survive. 2 weeks later, they met in a neutral office downtown. Richard Dalton looked older, gray threaded through his hair, eyes weary but pride still burning beneath. He didn't recognize Alyssa at first. She had changed, her posture straighter, her clothes professional, her tone steady. "So," Dalton said, glancing at her across the table, "you're the interested buyer?" "Yes," Alyssa said. "I believe I am." When their eyes met, realization flickered. He froze. "Wait, I know you." Alyssa nodded slowly. "You do. You evicted me from Maple Street. 11 years ago." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. Dalton looked away first. "That was business," he muttered. "Nothing personal." Alyssa smiled faintly. "Maybe. But this is business too." She slid a folder across the table. Inside was her offer, lower than his asking price but backed with proof of funds, renovation plans, and community endorsements. Everything about it was legitimate, professional, impossible to dismiss. Dalton flipped through the papers, his fingers trembling slightly. "You're serious?" "Very," she said. "And if you're smart, you'll take the deal. Because I know this property better than anyone else. You'd be selling it to someone who actually cares." He stared at her for a long time, the weight of irony pressing into his chest. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like surrender, he said the words Alyssa had dreamed of hearing for years. "It's yours." When the papers were signed, Alyssa sat in her car outside the building and cried, not tears of sadness, but release. She'd spent years fighting to rebuild her dignity, and now she held the deed to the very place that had once symbolized her powerlessness. The day she took possession, she brought Naomi and Caleb, now teenagers, to see it. "This is where we lived before," she told them. "The place we lost." Naomi ran her fingers along the cracked window frame. "You're fixing it again," she said. "Just like before." Alyssa smiled. "Only this time, no one can take it away." She hired contractors, repainted the walls, replaced the floors, and turned the old Maple Street apartments into affordable, modern homes. Every detail, down to the color of the doors, was chosen with intention. And on opening day, when the first tenants moved in, Alyssa hosted a small gathering. Neighbors came, reporters showed up, and word spread about the single mother who bought the building where she was once evicted. Dalton didn't attend, but he saw the coverage online. The headline burned into his screen. "From evicted to owner, woman buys former landlord's property to empower families." He stared at the article for a long time, then closed his laptop, a strange quiet settling in his chest. Success didn't make Alyssa arrogant. It made her generous. She started a mentorship program for single mothers who wanted to learn about real estate. She called it the Second Key Initiative, because everyone, she said, deserves another key to start over. Local investors noticed. Banks that once turned her away now invited her for partnerships. Her story became more than a personal victory. It became a movement. When she bought her 5th property, she made a decision. She would purchase the entire block surrounding Maple Street and rebuild it into a mixed-income community, part affordable housing, part business spaces, part community center. She named the project Hope Row. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, cameras flashed, city officials spoke, and Alyssa stood before the crowd holding her children's hands. Her voice trembled with emotion as she said, "Once, this block was where my dreams ended. Today, it's where they begin for others." Ownership isn't just about property, it's about reclaiming your story. Months later, while walking through one of her buildings, Alyssa saw a young mother struggling with rent payments. Instead of evicting her, Alyssa sat her down. "I know what it feels like to have nowhere to go," she said softly. "Let's find a way through this together." That moment, the empathy she'd been denied years ago, became her brand of justice. When Naomi left for college, majoring in architecture, she hugged her mother tightly and said, "You didn't just buy buildings, Mom. You rebuilt people." Alyssa smiled through tears. "And that's worth more than any mortgage." Years later, a journalist asked Alyssa what kept her going when the odds were stacked against her. She thought for a moment, then replied, "When that landlord evicted me, I thought he'd ended my story. But all he did was turn the page." Outside her office window, the Maple Street sign gleamed in the sun, freshly painted, standing tall, surrounded by new homes, laughter, and life. She had bought the block. But more importantly, she had bought back her power. Sometimes life has a way of turning pain into purpose. Alyssa's story isn't just about revenge, it's about resilience. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Hidden Tales Stories for more real-life stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us what strength truly means.